Hi, I'm Michael Hartman.
I'm Naomi Liu.
And I'm Mike Rizzo. And this is OpsCast,
a podcast for marketing ops pros
and RevOps pros.
Created by the Mo Pros, the #1 community for marketing operations professionals.
Tune in to each episode as we chat with real professionals to help elevate you in your marketing operations career.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of OpsCast, brought to you by marketingops.com, powered by all the Mo Pros out there. I am your host, Michael Hartman. Flying solo today, Mike Rizzo is actively getting ready for Mopsapalooza 2024 as we're recording this in, I guess we call it almost mid-October. It'll be, so we're just a few weeks away. So if you haven't registered, please do so. And Naomi's just busy. So anyway, that's okay. We're going to keep powering through. So today joining me is Devin Leshin, who is currently a marketing technologist at Microsoft. Prior to Microsoft, Devin held multiple roles in marketing operations and as a revenue engineer, which included client-facing activities as well as internal functions at an agency. Before that, he held roles in marketing technology, marketing, account management, and customer service at multiple organizations in a variety of industries. Devin has another part of his story that we're going to get into shortly, but I'm going to keep that as a little bit of a surprise and not spoil it right now. So, Devin, thanks for joining today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, and for our listeners, Devin was off camera, off microphone, off recording, whatever we want to call it, telling me that it's been a hectic, busy week for him, and we're going to make sure his voice powers through all this. So hang in there with us. All right. So now I've kept our listeners in suspense a little bit. Let's reveal that part of your career. Maybe do that in air quotes that I didn't mention up front. So earlier in your life, you were involved in professional wrestling, and we're going to get into how that helps you in your later career, including marketing operations and marketing technology. But first, why don't you, how about you share your story about how you got into the wrestling scene and what you did in that, and then how you transitioned from that to, I'll call it, corporate roles.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I was actually fully in the working world before then. I was working at the time for a very large hotel company and a manager level. And my brother and I have always, watched it since we were kids. Just to date myself here, when the pay-per-views were on cable, and he and I would use the rabbit ears on the TV to break through some of the static because it was too expensive for us to order.
I remember those days. If you held it, when you had to stand there holding the rabbit ears, right?
Yep. So that was the WrestleMania 1 days, the Hulk Hogan days. So we've always been fans of it. I didn't know that there were all these sort of layers to the industry. I compare it to, say, like baseball, where you have your major league, and then you have your triple A's, and you have your double A, single A, that kind of stuff. Same thing with wrestling. So both my parents were public school teachers, and so that means my dad worked 4 jobs to help with the bills. And one of those, he was bartending, and he picked up where he was the head bartender at an Elks Lodge, where I grew up in Virginia. And he knew wrestling, but he didn't know quite so much. But he recognized that there was some name. They were having a show at the place, and he thought it was this bigger group coming in. So he sent him. He called my brother and I and said, "Hey, come over. There's all this stuff going on." So I went over there early, and it was what we call an indie company, an independent company, a very small organization, but they paid to bring in some bigger names, bigger wrestlers, more famous ones, and they were having all these problems with their set, basically. And like I said, I was working in a hotel at the time, so I had access to the AV closet and whatnot. And I said, "Oh, what do you need?" So ran out there, got the stuff, came back, helped them set it up. I was then responsible for all the equipment, and because I can't help but do this in every day of my life, and people that work with me will attest to this, I was making suggestions and all this other kind of stuff for improving the presentation. And so after the show, the promoter, the head of that company, was like, "Hey, you're really into this. Have you thought about training?" And I was like, "Training? what? And so they had a wrestling school that they ran also, in addition to this promotion. And so he told me where it was, and I went to go check it out. I didn't even know this thing, this type of thing existed. Next thing you know, I'm signed up for training. I'm doing that, 3 or 4 days a week, including weekends, learning how to be in that industry. And then soon enough, I was on shows and portraying a character, and started off with that particular promotion. Which is what you tend to do, and then you branch out to other ones. So
Amazing.
Kind of slipped into it. Yeah.
Did you do? I don't think we talked about this when we first talked, but were you in doing any other sports or athletics beforehand, or is this was it a brand new thing?
Well, it had been a while, right? So this was 1999, so a good 7 years, I guess, after high school was over, and that sort of thing. But yeah, when I was in high school and younger, up until an injury, because everybody's got an injury in high school, right? I played mostly basketball and baseball, mostly baseball more than anything else. So yeah, definitely was in that. I would not say I was athletic when I was getting involved in wrestling at all. It definitely pushed me in that regard, and it likely affected my the roles that I took on within wrestling, just because I was not going to be the human action figure built person, right? Some of my friends were, but I was not. So that's where I rather than being an actual wrestler, although I did wrestle in a few matches over the time I was in, I was what they call a manager. So for anybody that's familiar with pro wrestling, it's the mouthpieces, the ones that are outside the ring and on the microphone and stirring up the storylines and talking for wrestlers and that kind of thing. And so it became very quickly apparent to me that in terms of within the industry where my value was, in addition to helping the show itself, and pushing the emotions and the story of the show along, it was to help wrestlers that were maybe younger or just hadn't quite grasped all of the skills they needed quite yet to interact with the crowd and get the kind of response they needed to get, or know how to talk on the microphone, what we call promos and that kind of thing. And so that was my role. And then I had a very strong, even though I couldn't necessarily execute physically everything, I had a very strong mind for how it was supposed to work. And so I was also someone that mentored and taught how to do those things to the younger people also.
Well, it's two thoughts. One is what you mentioned, like you didn't know all the layers to things. And I think I had a moment like that, probably similar to you. It's going to age me. It was in the age before when you had to travel and you couldn't get Wi-Fi, right? And there weren't always movies. You had to actually talk to people or read a book. And I leaned towards talking to people. Surprise, I'm doing a podcast.
Right.
But I was talking to this one guy, and we were chatting, what do you do? And he told me, he said, I sell food grade adhesives. And I just was like, what? And it was the first time I realized, like, there's somebody out there, or company out there, that is making the glue that is used to seal food products, right? So candy bars or cereal boxes, and it never occurred to me that wasn't just something that the manufacturers did on their own, right?
Right.
And it made me realize like this, like there's so many layers to some of these things in the economy and everything. It was just like a big aha moment.
Yeah,
it's interesting to me. Go ahead.
Everyone wants to have the big idea, right? The big breakthrough product that's going to, allow them to retire and have a nice life. What people maybe don't think about though is some of the people that over lifetime that come up with things that allow them to do that. I mean, somebody invented Velcro, right? Somebody invented a snap or a button. Like those are all vital things that the world needs. So I always joke, like when I'm trying to think of what I want to do next or on the side for a side hustle, I'm not thinking like, I try not to think about what's the next big thing. To me, it's more, okay, what's the next Velcro?
Right.
What's the next thing that the world needs and it doesn't necessarily know it needs, but if it got out there, everybody would use it. And it would become part of everything. That's
for sure
the mindset.
The other thing that it just occurred to me, we just recently had a guest on who started her career in theater. And I'm not going to say that I'm equating theater to pro wrestling.
Oh, no, you can. It is.
But I am.
It is.
And it just occurred to me that actually, like, you probably both, especially given the role, the way you described your role as sort of being kind of involved with the operational pieces of producing the wrestling matches and the theater that went with it, right? Is like, so did you like that? Like, do you think there's parallels there? Like that kind of stuff applies? Yeah, right.
Totally. Yeah, there's actually a lot going on in the wrestling world now because I'm still around it. When I was going through, and this is a good parallel to business, I will say. And again, I was in the corporate world at the time I was in wrestling, so I wasn't in marketing quite yet. I was in a managerial role, and then I went from that into the tech world and IT and that sort of thing, and then eventually I got into marketing. I was already out of wrestling at that point, but I know we'll get to that in a little bit. But there's a sort of a mini war going on in the wrestling world. Just different schools of thought. When I went through, it was very rigid, and it was starting to transition out of like sort of the old school mentality, but not really. And there were a lot of rules. I mean, you would be surprised at the number of things that you had to do as a trainee, as somebody newer in the business, as a veteran in the business. Like all these things, there's sort of a code and behavior structure. There are certain ways of being that training occurred, mentoring, getting mentors and that sort of thing, which you had to have if you were going to get past a certain point, which again, that'll tie into the business discussion we get into. But when I say like rigid rules, I mean, there was a thing that every time you walked into a locker room, you went around, unless you were the veteran, that was the exception. People came to you in that case. But if you were not the vet, you would, or you weren't sure, it defaulted to you when you walked into that locker room and there were people there, you walked around and you shook everybody's hand and you said your name and they said their name and good to see you. And I mean, it's a little less rigid if you've been on the same show with the same people for a while and you all know each other. Then it's more like, oh, hey man, how you doing? But you never assume that, right? You never assume that they're going to remember who you are, especially if they're a bigger name than you, because how many people do they meet, right? So there's like rigid rules like that, and there's reasons behind it. There was reasons behind it. Well, that kind of slipped away more recently, and that's where I say there's like this way of doing things is different now. Not that one's better than the other, but like the handshake thing's kind of like the newer trainers in the world and the newer schools, like, you don't have to do that. That's ridiculous. So there's this sort of like rift happening and this change happening. And so, Vince McMahon, of course, the former head of WWF, WWE, very publicly had to, for financial reasons, came out and said, "Hey, this is scripted, right? Like this isn't a real sport," because he was going to get taxed as a real sport. And he was like, "It's not," And that's the first time where that actually happened, where it was admitted, and that was many, many years ago. And so that cat's out of the bag a bit. And I'm going to say there's ways that we, in the wrestling world, they still cover through that, but the with that being exposed, it changes a lot of things. And one of the things that it changed is, like you're saying, the comparisons, right? It's Hollywood in a way. It's theater. It's instead of, I joke that it's a soap opera. And just instead of like people, having affairs with other people's relatives and whatnot, it's, you get into fights. Sometimes the affair thing happens too, and that leads to the fight. But the resolution of the conflict happens through a match, through the physical confrontation. Otherwise, it's a soap opera. I'm not going to say it's a soap opera for men, because some people say that, and you look at our crowd, there's there's just as many that are not. And I will also say, when we get into more of how I connected the marketing role, that was one of the things that I brought to the table. I feel like in a lot of the companies I work for that changed things. So I'm going to ask you, I'll pop quiz you. Okay, you did not know this. Everybody, Michael did not know this was coming. I have a pop quiz for him. Okay, so who do you think? I'm going to give you the three categories, but which of these categories do you think are should be the target audience for a wrestling company to promote to. You have the male part of the family, to be speaking in binary terms, but the father role or the brother role or uncle or what have you. You have the mother or aunt type of role, and then you have the children. Which of those three do you think you would? When I say market to, I'm talking about outside of the showtime, like flyers and where you promote.
Hey everyone, Mike Rizzo here, CEO of marketingops.com and co-host of OpsCast. I've got a little secret to share with you, something that's been one of the best kept perks of our community until now. At marketingops.com, we've built a hiring program that's changing the game for marketing operations recruitment, and we're finally sharing it with the world. Our community is over 22,000 strong, and within that, we have over 4,400 members who are actively and passively seeking new opportunities. These are seasoned professionals with skills and experience spanning platforms like HubSpot, Pardot, Marketo, and so much more. Plus, we can help you fine-tune your outreach, targeting exactly the right candidates by region, years of experience, seniority level, or even agency experience. But here's the real cherry on top. When you hire through our program, your new team member gets a free membership or a virtual ticket to our annual conference. From day one, they're not just stepping into a new role, they're getting access to the training, networking, and support they need to hit the ground running. So if you're ready to unlock this incredible opportunity, it's time to let this secret out. Visit marketingops.com and find your next star teammate today. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep optimizing.
Okay, so first off, like children kind of overlaps with the other two, but I would go towards children, and here's I think what I immediately thought of is there's a reason why products are advertised to kids that are not necessarily products that kids would use, just because the kids drive the behavior for the parents, right? Mm-hmm. We need to get this thing, look at this cool thing, right? So my guess would be kids, but I'm not, like, my confidence level is relatively low on that.
I would say there's that school of thought in wrestling. So wrestling promotions, before I got my hands in there, that I worked with, would either target the dads or the children, right? The dads, because that's who would have the interest. Typically, or the children, like you said, because like, hey, mommy, daddy, I want to go to this thing. Neither of those are incorrect. It's the moms, though, was where I brought the idea in, and here's why. So at its core, most of the matches in wrestling are two very well-built men in very little clothing, wrestling in the middle of a ring. If your significant other, your wife or girlfriend or whatever, told you, hey, I'm going to this event to watch this thing, you're going to go with them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you have children, they're definitely going to want to go, right? For the most part. So if you get the children, if you target to the children, then you might get one parent or the other. Or one adult or the other. If you target the dads or whatnot, you might get just them, or maybe them and a kid. If you target the moms, you get everybody.
Very interesting.
The whole family comes.
Yeah.
And that played out. We actually tested that in a couple cases. My character actually changed so that I personally was the bad guy that was targeting all the women in the crowd in the area and the women wrestlers, and we turned it into a whole thing, and it incentivized them to come to the show because they wanted to see me get what was coming to me. the ticket sales increased dramatically. One, because of where we marketed. I actually would go to, they had like all women gyms back then. I forgot the name of the chain now, but I would go in there. I would demand to be able to work out. I would go in there with a belt over my, the women's belt over my shoulder or whatever, the women's title. I would just, talk meanly to everybody, be the bad guy, get them all worked up and be like, well, if you guys, think you're better than me, like I'm going to be over here this Saturday at 7:00, come over there. Maybe I'll wrestle you, and I'll wrestle you. You can beat me up if you think you can. Don't think you could, but so we would do that kind of stuff. And oh boy, they would show up. They bring the whole families too. So instead of me helping sell one ticket, I was selling 4, 5, 6 tickets at a time.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that made me extremely valuable, right?
Yeah.
In a role that typically was not valuable, which I know we're going to talk about also, but.
Well, so I want to go back to, you already kind of touched on this a little bit, but one of the things you told me that you kind of learned along the way through this experience was how to sort of, I don't even want to say customize, but like really adjust your communication to different stakeholders who had different roles. You talked about some of the protocols or etiquette for the locker room. Tell me about what are some of the examples of that you then transferred over to professional life?
Yeah, sure. So it will probably be apparent the way I explain it, and I'll definitely draw those lines. So wrestling promotion at its core, you had a promoter, which is the person that owned the thing and was responsible for, promoting the show and selling the tickets and securing the venue and all that kind of good stuff. There was also a role that is called a booker, and that's the person that would, hire the wrestlers, hire the talent, usually had control over the creative part of the show and the story and that sort of thing. Sometimes in some places, the promoter and the booker were the same person. In other cases, the booker and the promoter were two different people, usually fairly close, either really good friends or relatives or something like that. And in other cases, the bookers were a team. It was a group of people, the creative team. So there might be 4 or 5 people that would write it, and that could be all kinds of people. So that was one layer. And I'll get into how, as a contractor, you had to interplay with those in a second, but let me just outline those categories. So you had that level. You have the stakeholders that were the locker room folks with you. So there were other wrestlers, other personalities on the show, referees, ring announcers, like all that kind of stuff was the locker room. You had tiers within the locker room. You had your veterans, you had your locker room leaders. And when I say veterans, it's not necessarily in the industry. There's that. Those were the real veterans. You also had people that had just been at that same promotion for so long that they had a little bit of a different layer to them. Like, we'll get into that in a second. But you had sort of a hierarchy within the locker room. And so that was the second layer. And the third layer was the fans, right? The crowd. And obviously, they were the ones that were buying the products. And I said products plural because it's not just tickets to the show. It's also concessions. It's also merchandise. It's buying things directly from the wrestlers or the personalities. They were the reason we were there. They were the ones spending the money. Okay, so in terms of corporate world, right? So the crowd is what we traditionally see as the customer, the ones that are bringing the money in. And so there was that. Again, going back to that old school, new school way of thinking, in the olden days, if you were a bad guy, your interaction with that crowd was during your time in the show, right? So during your segment, when you were out there and you did as much as you could, and your job was to get the show in the right way. There's a lot of psychology to wrestling, which is what I was drawn to. You're stirring up the emotions of the crowd to help the good guys be really good guys, right? And to get them to want to come back, the fans to come back for the next show. And so what you did not do in the old days was go out during intermission and sell your stuff. You did not interact with the crowd in any way, because how can you go out there and sell if you're supposed to be bad? That was the mentality. Well, that went away, right? That's now everybody's out there. The really good people, though, stay in character. They are, what I was able to do, and we can talk about that later too. I was able to sell a lot of product, which is where I made my money there. Still being the bad guy. In fact, I used that to sell my stuff. So there's that. The locker room was tricky, always tricky. But your locker room in the corporate world are your teammates, your partners on other teams, but at your layer of the corporate ladder, so to speak. And then again, there's the hierarchy. So I would include sort of like the idea of middle management and team leads and like that kind of thing in there also. Basically everything but the senior leadership at the company. And then the promoters and the bookers were senior leadership team types, right? Like your CEOs and presidents and owners and that kind of thing. And you had to act differently in wrestling to the locker room, to the promoters, and to the crowd, right? I mean, I would say that and some of the people that are listening that work at some of the companies are probably going to chuckle at this because they're going to relate this right to the corporate world. You had to talk a little differently to your promoters and your bookers than you might talk to the locker room people, right? I mean, I hate to say that you're brown nosing, but you're brown nosing. If you want to continue to work there and continue to get bookings every month, you did. And there's a balance there, and this is a tricky thing in the corporate world, I would say. But when you establish yourself in wrestling at that promotion, and they have faith that you're going to do what's right for their business, you got more control. You gain more control over your character and what you did. Mm-hmm. And to the possibility, and I had this in a few places where I became part of the booking team, right? Like I helped write the shows. That's a promotion. That's, not necessarily financial, but in terms of influence, right? I had situations where I was able to, my payment was I got to pick 3 or 4 other people to come with me to the shows. So I was now a valuable resource to my locker room folks because I was able to get them work in other places.
Right.
So there's some of that had to go on. In terms of the locker room, I mean, you're putting your well-being in people's hands in a lot of cases. So, you need to play nice. You need to advocate for yourself. You can't get walked on. At the same time, you have to play nice. And so there's a balance there that always had to happen. And the crowd, like I mentioned before, like you had to play the part. I will say that. I'm not going to say you always had to be nice to the crowd in wrestling. I mean, obviously you do in the corporate world.
I think it's, to me, what you're saying, like, it was important to understand the crowd, right? And what their motivations were so that you could better, do for the benefit of the organization, in this case, the promoters or the events. And I think that's one of the things you've hit on. A couple of things that I think to me are important, right? One, I tell people all the time, right? I hate it really is like fingernails on a chalkboard for me when people say internal customers, because I just, like, customers are customers, right? Mm-hmm. I understand the sentiment at the same time, right? Understanding, how your business makes money, right? And you being an advocate for doing what's right for those customers so that you generate the goodwill that they'll do business with you, right? That's an important piece. And I think marketing ops folks are in a position to be able to be those advocates and help out in that process, which leads to like this other one about this balancing act about playing nice, but not being run over, right? And I think a lot of people struggle and go from one extreme to the other, and really can't sort of walk that tightrope of being a self-advocate or, pushing back and providing feedback in a way that's constructive and is not seen as undermining and all that. Like, I think there's a lot of people who struggle with that. And it's interesting. I was listening to a separate session earlier today, and someone's like, "Oh, you got to do these things, but it's going to seem politicky." And I'm like, it doesn't, like, I think that's gotten a bad rap, like the idea that something is political. It's just the reality, right? I think like you work at Microsoft, giant corporation. I've worked at big companies. I've worked at small companies. My wife works at a very small nonprofit. Like there are politics in every place I've been, and every place I've seen, without exception. So like, if it feels politicky, like, then you're just not seeing the reality. Is in my book.
Yeah. So people used to tell me if there was more than one person in the room that the politics are involved. I would say even if you're by yourself, there's politics involved. maybe multiple voices going on in your head on what to do that you're compromising. But yeah, I totally agree with you. There's always that factor. One thing that you mentioned that triggered a thought I wanted to circle back on is when it, where people struggle with things, it changes depending on where you're at, right? Like you might handle a relationship with a manager in one way, and you guys get comfortable with that dynamic, and as most companies do, things shift around, or you get a new role, or whatever, and you're under somebody else. You have a new manager, and then you have to kind of start all over again. And that dynamic may be different. You may have to advocate differently than you did, and where there's a struggle is that adjustment. How do you advocate for yourself with this person? Okay, I got that. And then you start, and I'm kind of living this a little bit, and then you have a new manager, and you advocate yourself in the same way at first because that's what you're used to, and that doesn't work anymore. So you have to recalibrate and figure out how that works. And I think the difference between, say, wrestling and the corporate world was in wrestling, you had two layers. You had the individual relationships that you had to learn how the psychology was going to operate there. And then you had mass, psychology, where you had like the whole crowd. You needed hundreds or thousands of people to all respond the way you wanted them to. And they're very different. They're very different.
Of course. Yeah.
So, but that was all really good. And I know, the folks listening are, obviously are marketing business folks. I don't want to not swing from the wrestling enough. So hopefully we're doing that. The transition to marketing for me from wrestling, so again, I was in other industries first, was fairly quick. It was just like, and I went into marketing on a tech side. It was more around the database maintenance and the integration with the CRM and the marketing automation tools and that kind of thing. Less about the marketing. The problem that I have run into continuously in my career in marketing ops is that I have this background. I've been in sales. I've been in customer service. I've been in wrestling, which is everything. I get the marketing place, right? Because at the end of the day, where I think marketing as a general rule may, this is a soapbox. I don't know if you want me to get on or not, where I feel like marketing is going astray over recent times in an effort to validate itself as an organization. It's getting very short-term minded as an industry, where marketing is not designed to be that way. And so where I have always come in with marketing is, and this is because this is where I feel comfortable and one of my strengths and what helped me in wrestling a lot, and where I learned in wrestling and honed it, is the ability to recognize a pattern. I mean, this is what marketing is at a base, right? How do you recognize a pattern? What mechanisms do you need to have in place to be able to see the pieces of information that will allow the pattern to be recognized by you? How can you push and poke and pull on various levers to play into that pattern to reach an outcome that is advantageous? And what does that look like operationally? Like what does that pulling of the lever really mean in terms of what you're doing? Yeah. And to me, at the end of the day, that's really all marketing is. And as long as you stick to those pillars, everything else kind of falls into place, right? I will have people that are either going to cheer me on this or just go, oh my God, what a nut job this guy is. When I say this, I'm not, as a marketer, I'm not worried about the revenue piece. I'm not. Because to me, if I do all of the things that I'm supposed to do, and I do those things really well, the revenue will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that I don't think you don't care about the revenue, because you do, right? You do, but I think you're taking a step back on, like, I think you're reacting to this current, fairly consistent current state, which I agree with, which is so much focus on near-term results from marketing efforts, right? So things like attribution reporting and ROI and all that. And it's not to say that those aren't important to some degree, but they're not the be all end all, right? And I think, the best marketers or ones that I admire absolutely want to measure impact of what they do.
Sure.
At the same time, they also have been able to carve out a substantial portion of their budget. Let's do it that way, because that's really what tells you where you got your priorities, right? Carve out a substantial portion of their budget to do things that are essentially, you either the ability to measure them is really, really challenging, so you don't even bother with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, or you're like, this is just some crazy thing I want to try, and they've earned the right to be able to do that a little bit. But part of that's because they do focus on the revenue, but I don't think they focus on, like, this particular campaign has to drive this X amount of revenue in this 3 months or 6 months, right? And I think that's, to me, the difference. And I think we had an episode, it's one of our most downloaded ones, it's now a couple of years old, where we talked about it, is like, I think the title is like something like, is attribution ruining marketing, right? And and to some degree, I think this desire to see very short-term results, financial results out of marketing, has driven behaviors that aren't necessarily good for the long term.
Right.
Unfortunately, right, CEOs, boards, investors, right, that's what they're geared towards, is seeing the revenue and growth and things like that to continue to grow. So I think there's just like a balance.
Yeah, most of them came out of the sales world, the sales side, right?
For
the most part.
Yeah.
Then there's not a lot of CMOs to CEO moves that should happen. And I should clarify too. It's not that I don't care about the revenue. I think the point I'm trying to make is it's become such the singular primary focus of marketing.
Well, I think specifically net new logo revenue has been the driver. Like, it's not even revenue. Like, it's not even like retaining and growing existing customers has become even less of a focus.
Well, of course, where I sit, I'm going to see that a little differently just because of my role at Microsoft. And of course, Microsoft's a whole different beast because it's so large. I'm on the side of the marketing house that is just for existing customers and digging in there. What I found over time at many, just across, I think a lot of companies do not know how to market to existing customers. No. It's not the focus. Since so many people focus on net new, there hasn't been as much attention on growing the revenue. And I never, again, quite understood that, because here's a pool of people that already know who you are and already like what you do. Why couldn't you farm that?
Or they don't, right?
And you can turn it around or whatever, right? Yeah. I think where I'm going in my mind about these things is, to your point, like about attribution. God, I hate attribution. MQLs and all these things that we, marketers come up with to sound important. It goes back to what I was saying, though, in terms of the pillars, right? It's not that revenue is not important. It's not that attribution is not important. It's not those things aren't important. It's important in the sense that, to me, it's important in the sense that it allows you to see the pattern, see if the pattern's changing, because it will, and then adjust to those patterns. It's valuable to me in that sense. And I know this is a battle I'm always going to lose because at this point, because we're at a stage now where a marketing organization has to prove its existence. It's no longer where companies will allow it to be a cost center. It's got to be a profit driving part of the org. And I think I think it's a mistake, to be honest. I think we're losing aspects of what marketing used to do that are valuable.
Yeah.
See, if they can't tie it into those things.
I'm not willing to just give up on the idea that marketing is only going to be around if they can prove they're a profit center. I think,
I hope not.
But I do think it's incumbent on marketers to do a better job of articulating the value they bring to an organization in a way that the rest of the organization will understand. And it's not about things like website visits and MQLs and
right,
pipeline that you influence. I mean, those can be pieces of it, but they're probably not the most important piece because, to your point, right? And this is old data, and I don't remember off the top of my head the exact numbers, but something like there's some research. This is probably 10 years old now, but I doubt it's changed. Is that like something like less than 5% of people on boards, corporate boards, have any experience in marketing management?
Yeah.
So a lot of them come out of finance, sales, operations.
Yep.
So it's natural that like what you don't understand, if you fear. So you need to be able to but to me, that's important. Like, stop complaining about them not understanding what you do. Your job is to help understand what they're looking for and communicate it better. I'm not saying it's easy,
right?
But like, that's your job.
And I think that also the in some cases it's they don't know. I think in worse cases it's
shame on them then.
They think they know and it's wrong or it's old. I mean, how many people that may be listening to this have run into situations where either at where you work or have worked, or just even if you tell people, the question, what do you do for a living outside of work? And you say marketing, they're like, oh, you make ads.
Yep.
You're the ad people. You do commercials? Like,
yes.
Are you, what do you make?
The pretty picture department.
Right. So it's there's a little bit of that. And so it's easy sometimes for senior leadership to want to cut marketing because let us scroll back the ads as long as we have salespeople calling, that's all, And so there's I think more dangerous than not knowing is misunderstanding. And to your point, I mean, that's up to marketing. There's so many things that marketers spin wheels on. And to your point, I don't know if it's necessarily the right things because they're not helping clear up that picture with the people that need to have it cleared up. I
use the phrase like there are things that only marketers care about.
Yeah, that's where I was heading. Right?
Yeah,
exactly. That's exactly right. And so I always joke, like, it seems to me when I'm, if you go on LinkedIn or any of these, we'll call them professional social networks or professional networks, and you see what people are writing and they're marketing people writing, I'm thinking like, who are you writing that to? Because it sure sounds like you're trying to write that to other marketing people, like, which is fine, especially if that might be your customer. Like maybe you're trying to sell into that.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that, like, who are we? Are we trying to convince each other of this? Like, what's going on? We're not necessarily communicating to the people that need to hear it or need to see into our world, and so there's all kinds of things. I mean, I do this too. I mean, it's not like I'm sitting on a hill somewhere.
I mean, none of us are immune from.
I've had two creative directors in my lifetime that, and if they're listening, they'll know exactly who they are, where they had an extremely critical eye on all things that were produced, and I inherited that from them, just working alongside them for so much. And it is, I'm very open that I have ADHD and potentially autism and some other things. And so if my brain gets hung up on something, it is very tough for me to let go.
Sure.
And if I'm looking at an email that I'm supposed to be coding into the platform, and there's an orphaned word in the subject, in the headline, oh my gosh, like I can't move unless I fix that. And nobody, does anybody really care about that? That's getting
that is that's like the example I use all the time, an orphan word on a paragraph or a headline that, like, because the level of effort to try to fix that, especially in things like an email,
Right.
Which you never know, like, is so hard. I actually worry like it's going to have unintended consequences and actually make things look worse.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Did I ever tell you my semi serious, semi not serious line about creating emails?
What's that?
The rule of thumb is that you create an email like it's the year 1985.
I don't think you told me that, but I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean, we're using tables. Like, you still need to use tables. You can't use any of the stuff used on a website. I mean, you could. It's getting there, but no, not. Yeah. If you coded like it's 1985, you should be good.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. Gosh, we have gone all over. So I want to maybe wrap up on a general notion here. So I think we've talked about this a little bit, but this, like, you and I think it feels like we both have a similar view on, like, there's a point where you're trying to advocate for yourself or communicate with other people, and how do you approach these challenging conversations where you're trying to, like, hopefully in good faith, right, provide feedback that may not be taken well. Say designer, you're calling their baby ugly is the way they might perceive it, even if that's not what your intent is, right?
Right.
But it's definitely a possibility of how they'll perceive it. So how do you do that? Like this advocating for yourself, advocating for the customers, for your team, whichever thing, versus, not undermining that relationship with this other stakeholder that's important, regardless of what their group that you outlined before.
So I wish I was better at doing that. I will tell you that there's been some recent pains on my still learning there. I'm much better at that in wrestling. It seems so much easier then. I would say that what I'm learning and what seems to be working, there's a few tips that I've picked up recently that seem to have changed the tone of the room, I would say. One, if it's possible, I will type it out for myself first and then read it aloud if it's that kind of communication where I can do that, so I can hear how it sounds. Often by doing that, you will pick up on things that you didn't realize when it was in your head. So that's the first thing. I will also, again, if time allows this to happen, I lean heavily into AI now. One of the things that I tell people about all the time I'm just going to use Outlook as an example. Folks will say, oh, I use Outlook to write, Copilot or AI to write my email. I don't do that. I write my email, and then there's a coaching function in there that will read through it and give me tips like, hey, maybe soften this, or, make sure you include this, or somebody may perceive it that way. And so that's been strong in helping me frame my emails differently. And I would say if you have advantage, the advantage of that or access to that, use that to your advantage. In terms of conversations, that's where it gets trickier for me, especially if there's a time crunch and I'm trying to just like get my message across, because I can sometimes be very direct. I'm trying to curb that a little bit. So what I would say there is, my favorite phrase is, oh, have you considered, or how do you think this would look if, or, acknowledging what they're doing, right? Like, oh, I see what you did here, and I totally get that. I'm wondering if somebody may interpret it as, how about, and I'm trying to get out of the solutioning world in that. Like, instead of me suggesting like, hey, how about this? It might be like, hey, what do you think? Is there like some other way we might be able to approach this? And then it turns into a conversation where then they'll ask potentially for inputs from you. And then you kind of circumvent some of that without it being like, oh, here's the know-it-all telling me how to do my job. That's really the goal for me right now, is how do I support what they're doing, acknowledge what they're trying to do, and then give them an opening without losing face of considering another perspective on how it might get interpreted when that thing happens, and then see if they have other ways of doing it. And if not, then they might engage you in the conversation, and now you have a conversation, and now you've overcome that hump.
So it's interesting. You sort of talked about a couple of things. One, I think you're doing different things for written versus verbal conversations. I think it's really important to know, like, what's the right medium to use for different types of conversations. That's number one. But the thing that also just popped in my head, the way you described those two things, on the one hand, you're using some tools to help help you with your blind spots, right? So when I write something, right, how could this be interpreted that I'm not even thinking about? On the other hand, what you're doing with the other people when you're having that conversation, providing feedback, you're helping them with their blind spots, potentially, right? And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And a lot of what you described ties nicely with, to people, like one of the most impactful books I got the book and training, and I would it's called Crucial Confrontations. And that idea of what you described, like starting a conversation with them with, I understand what you're trying to do, or like, help me understand, right? You're trying to understand their point of view, not assume, make intent or what they were trying to accomplish, clarifying that. And then getting into, okay, what if we did this, right? And I think that is similar to sort of the framework that you get with Crucial Confrontations, which is all about trying to affect behavior change with a challenging conversation, or anticipating a challenging conversation. Anyway, so I love that. The last thing, I like, just my own experience, I would add to this, like, if you're a leader and you're hearing this, I think it's really important to demonstrate what this looks like to your team. And I think I have a good example. You talked about, changing people you report to, right? So I have an example of one place where I was reporting to the CMO. CMO had 12 people reporting to him, decided that was too many, consolidated. Well, it turns out one of my peers became my boss, right? Luckily, we had a good relationship going into it. But one of the things we established pretty quickly, and I think I was fortunate in this, is that we really realized that, like, we each had our own strengths and we complemented each other if we would let our egos get in the way.
Right.
And the way that showed up, there was at least one time when we were in a meeting with many other people, and we were literally like, we weren't like, it wasn't a yelling match, but we disagreed about something. And ultimately, right, her decision, she had the responsibility for it, and said, okay, we'll make it happen. Right. It was like, I voiced but we did it in a public forum. And I can't tell you how many people came up to me and was like, are you two okay? Like I was confused because it felt so natural to be able to have that kind of thing. It didn't feel like, but I suspect like what it made me realize is, like, that's not the norm for a lot of people, is to be able to have that kind of conversation and still walk away and have respect. And
that's right. Right.
Okay. Now there's a line where it crosses, and but we never got there, and I'm grateful for that.
Good.
This has been awesome. I know we started out with the pro wrestling, and I think there's this connection to, like, this ability to, like, work with lots of different stakeholders and adjust what you're doing and recognize that it was a really important. It sounds like that's the big thing that carried over from your experience in pro wrestling. Any other, like, major things that we didn't hit on that you wanted to cover before we wrap it up here?
No, I mean, I think that sums it up pretty well. I would say that pattern recognition is the key skill to practice and hone and have in marketing and marketing ops. So that's the other thing I took from wrestling. I think that's key. I think that's also missing a lot. And don't be afraid of having, like, short-term and long-term things that you're, planning as an organization or as an individual. I think having the short-term to short-term hops, and again, this was something I've learned in wrestling. You can do a story for a show, and that's great. It's better if you can do a story for the next 15 shows, and then how to break it down at each one. It just was a better product. And I think that's the case in business too. Have your North Star, and then just break it into pieces and how you're going to get there, as opposed to, the expression that I hate that people talk about is flying the plane while you're building it.
that's great, except you might end up with a motorcycle and you need it to fly. So,
Yeah.
That's the other thing I would leave with.
Interesting. Well, hey, Devin, appreciate it. If folks do want to keep up with you or learn more about what you're doing, I don't know, is there a place where they can connect with you or follow you?
Yeah, sure. So right now I would just point folks to LinkedIn, and last name is Leshin, and just send me an invite there. Let me know that you caught this show and this is where you heard from me, and send that over there. There are things that I am going to be working on here as soon as I can get some equipment in play, in terms of some video types of things, and I'll combine that with LinkedIn as soon as I can. So just keep an eye on LinkedIn. That's the best place to go.
Solid. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you, Devin, for sharing. It's been a fun conversation. We covered lots of ground. Thanks to our audience for continuing to support us and providing ideas and ideas for topics and guests. And if you, as always, if you are interested in being a guest or have a suggestion for a guest or a topic, please don't hesitate to reach out to Naomi, Mike, or me on LinkedIn or in the marketingups.com community. Until next time, everybody, we'll see you soon. Bye.